My first impression of John Birch was not altogether good.
Nobody in China impressed me like John Birch. He dressed, he lived, he ate, he slept, everything as the Chinese did.
That's when I learned that he was doing covert activity, and we were told that whenever he came in, to give him whatever he needed.
He had a great sense of right and wrong.
John also desired to stay and continue to serve the Lord.
He had, I think, such a profound belief in God that he was absolutely fearless.
He loved this country. He loved the people of this country.
And he did an awful lot for China.
But he was a great American working in a very hard way in a very difficult place.
And whatever he pursued, he pursued it with all of his vigor and with all his vitality and with all of his mind and spirit.
I certainly would like to see John Birch given that which he had so deservedly did not get.
Who was John Birch? Who was this American whose name was given to a controversial yet powerful organization, whose very mention excites strong emotions? Why has the name John Birch become the ultimate anti-communist symbol? Actually, the truth is surprising. John Birch was a man who only a few Americans knew, yet his influence resounds in many echelons of society. John Birch began life in faraway Lander, India, May 28, 1918. His parents were Christian missionaries.
John was a very precocious child, and Mother realized that he was caught on things very quickly, and not wanting John to learn pidgin English, she insisted that the Hindustani people who maintained their house while Mother and Father were teaching at the Christian college there in Landau, that they only speak to him in Hindustani. Now, Mother and Father would speak to him at night in English, so he understood English, but he was much more fluent in Hindustani. At the time of about 2 or 2.5, my father contracted malaria, and the doctors there told him he had to get out of that hot climate or he would not survive. And so Mother and Father and John, the time they left India for America.
John grew up in rural Georgia, the oldest of 7 children.
When he was a little over 3 or 3.5 years old, had memorized the account of the 3 wise men from the book of Matthew. And the superintendent of the Sunday school where they were attending found out that John had memorized this, and during the Christmas play they were going to put on that year, he asked John if he would recite it. And John, being far from an introvert, was just delighted to show off his talent and ability and was just most happy to do it. But he insisted on having his Testament before him. He didn't want anybody to know that he couldn't read. So he was holding up the Testament and quoting away the whole account, and all of a sudden the whole front of the church started snickering and laughing. And Mother and Father couldn't understand why in the world they were laughing at this, her handsome son, who was doing such a beautiful job of reciting this entire account. And then they realized John had his Testament upside down.
John excelled in high school and graduated with honors at a younger age than his classmates.
As a student, I think he was a delight to the teachers for the most part. There was plenty to talk about. I was inquisitive, and John was a big talker, and he had a great voice and expressed himself quite well, and certainly convinced me and anybody else I knew of his communication skills. He definitely was that. He'd be a good anchor man now, I think. John definitely had the drive to achieve. We had the basic subjects. I think the only foreign language we had was a couple of years in high school. which was French, because you could find a teacher that could teach French. But I don't think our school, I don't think high school anywhere would have been a tremendous challenge to him. I think he sort of walked through whatever subject he had, which was an indication of just how smart he was.
John Birch entered Mercer University in Macon, Georgia in the fall of 1935 and plunged into campus activities at once.
He was there at the early age of 16. My first impression of John Birch was not altogether good, because I thought he was a smart aleck, I thought he was cocky, I thought he was a person who knew it all, and I also thought he was very immature. But later on I learned that here was a very intelligent young man. He made the highest grades possible at the university. He was very alert, he was very brilliant. He also was very much of a loner. He was found in the library studying. He was a student of the Word of God. He was a student of English literature. He was a student of American history or medieval history, whatever it might be. He was a very, very intelligent young man, one that I respected and one that I was so honored to be a fellow student with him.
He was a stalwart member of the debate team from freshman through senior years. He excelled in dramatics and journalism and was selected to represent the university as its Rhodes Scholar candidate in his senior year. During his senior year, the fundamental religious nature of young John Birch, along with a dozen other ministerial students, questioned the theology of certain members of the faculty and staff, believing that they were not teaching biblical truths. On March 30th, 1939, a formal hearing was conducted by the University Executive Committee Board of Trustees into heresy charges alleged by these students, led by John Birch.
John was bringing a heresy charge against some of his professors, and it was all in the newspaper. Every day there was something about it, and every time I read it, it made me mad, because they were trying to hurt John and the people that were standing with him.
These allegations created an uproar among the citizens of Macon and surrounding communities. Although all who were charged were exonerated, such exonerations did nothing to dissuade young Birch from pursuing his fundamental beliefs. His devoutly religious nature was revealed as he served as student pastor at Benevolence Baptist Church his last 2 years at Mercer University.
Everybody at Benevolence just loved John, and they all tried to be a mom and daddy to him. They all liked him and respected him and knew that he was a man of God. John used to come every weekend whenever he preached, and he'd stay at our house because it was real close to the church and real convenient, and we all wanted him to stay. Well, anyway, he always slept in the bed that my brother had been sleeping in, and my brother wasn't home anymore. And so one night, my sister, my older sister, Norma Jo, she was known to be a sleepwalker. So she just got right up and she did her little sleepwalking thing, and then went in there and started to got in the bed with John, and just as she was getting in the bed with him, he woke up and woke her up. Well, the whole family just teased him about that forever.
We went down to the church that night in Cordele, and of course I always passed the collection plate around. I was sitting right next to John. He put his hand in his pocket and just pulled it out like that and put all of his money in the collection plate. Well, we all got out of the meeting. We started home, got halfway home, and the lights went out on the old car. So John said, got out and looked. He said, anybody got any money, a penny? And we all looked. Nobody had any money. We'd all put all our money in the collection plate. So we kept rambling around. We found 1 penny. So John put the thing in the light somehow or another, and we got the car started, lights on, and it got home okay. So we all had a good laugh about that, because nobody had a penny but that one in the whole crowd.
The religious liberalism espoused by certain elements at the university may well have been a contributing factor to John's decision to pursue further theological studies to gain more insight into biblical truths. In the fall of 1939, upon his graduation, magna cum laude from Mercer, young Birch enrolled in the Fundamental Baptist Bible Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, to enter the ministry and to fulfill his desire to become a lifetime missionary. His determination propelled him to complete his studies in just 1 year. In July 1940, Birch set sail for Shanghai, China, to become a missionary in the service of the Fundamental Baptist Church. His companion student and missionary, Oscar Wells, sailed with him to China. The greatest challenge facing the young missionaries was to learn the complex Chinese language.
A missionary friend of mine from Hangzhou, China, told me personally that when John arrived as a missionary in China, that in 7 months he was speaking the Mandarin language very fluently. You could not tell the difference between John speaking and that of a national. And that will tell you how brilliant the man really was.
The Lord has been blessing my study of Chinese, and I find it interesting and easy. After 6 weeks of study, I took an exam on a 3-month unit in the Shanghai Language School on September 15. They gave me 96%, the highest grade they've given in over a year. The Chinese are indeed a wonderful people. I never dreamed of such capacity to endure suffering. When they have been born again, they make wonderful Christians. They make one realize that we Americans have never known suffering. Their expression for suffering, Jianku, eat bitterness, fits China today. Oh, how they need him who is the bread of life. John Birch, letter to the Fundamentalist newspaper, December 6, 1940.
It was John's desire to work with and among the Chinese people. His fluency with the language enabled him to be sent to Hangzhou in 1941. Here he taught at a Chinese school and worked with Chinese ministers. That area of China was under the heel of the Japanese occupation forces since fighting began over 3 years earlier. Birch managed to breach the Japanese lines and carry his ministry to the rural Chinese, the only missionary from Hangzhou to do so.
Now at that time, the war between China and Japan was already on, and there was a crisis on in the world. Hitler was already marching. Mussolini had invaded Ethiopia. And so John and Oscar Wells were going as young men into a strange country. But John Birch thought the safest place was in the center of God's will. When the Americans were ordered out of China, our missionaries failed to respond to that challenge, and they stayed.
Knowing that the one safe place for a child of God is the center of the Father's will, and that we came out here on His call, I expect to stick around till He calls me away. I cannot feel that probable withdrawal of U.S. protection and the possible internment by the Japanese constitute a divine recall. Psalms 27. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. Mother Sweet plans to return to Shanghai this week, so I shall be alone with the Chinese and the Lord. Needless to say, I appreciate your prayers. John Birch, letter to the Fundamentalist newspaper, December 6, 1940.
At the outbreak of war on December 7, 1941, the Japanese were determined to take John Birch as a prisoner. He avoided capture and fled to the city of Shangzhou, which was under Japanese occupation. Birch was completely cut off from America.
Returning from a trip to Shanghai for the purchase of Bibles, I reached the safe side of the Chinese lines just before the war broke out. Others will soon be coming from Shanghai to join us as the doors to gospel preaching in Jap-occupied territory are rapidly closing. I have 7 people here looking to me for their daily rice. I have received no actual money since the U.S. $50 which came through the National City Bank of New York on October 15, 1941. John Birch, letter to the Fundamentalist newspaper, May 8, 1942.
On April 18, 1942, Colonel James H. Doolittle led a group of American airmen on a surprise bombing raid over Japan. The raid galvanized America and the free world with new hope. But the heroic Doolittle air raid was to be a turning point in the life and fortunes of missionary John Birch.
One day, because of the desperate need of those that were interned of his missionary group in Shanghai, he and a Chinese aide and helper went as far into occupied China, controlled by the Japanese, as far as he would dare go. While in a little restaurant, heading back into free China, he was seated at a little table, eating some meager food, and all of a sudden, a Chinese bumped into his table, and as if to say, excuse me, leaned over and said, "If you're an American, follow me." John waited a few minutes so it would not arouse anyone's suspicion and followed the young man. As they approached the banks of a river or stream that was close by, they found a sampan. And inside of this sampan was Colonel Doolittle and those who had parachuted with him after bombing Tokyo, the famous Tokyo Raiders. And this was the famous Doolittle of the Doolittle Raiders.
We were in a sampan, and it was covered, doors on each end, and we were tied up at the dock. I think they were changing crews.
We're trying to get to Chongqing, which was the provisional capital at that time. And they put us on the boat, and it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and we heard a knock on out on the wood. And a voice said, "Are there Americans in there?"
And they didn't say anything. They were afraid to speak. They didn't know if it was a trap on a Japanese. And he spoke again, and one of the young men who was part of Doolittle's crew, being a good Southern boy, said, "There's no Jap that could ever speak like that. It's got to be American Southern."
Paul Leonard, who was there close by, was after this knock, and this fellow talked in American, and he said something about Jesus Christ. And this fellow outside says, "Well, that's a very good name, but I'm not him." And that was John Birch, who we invited in.
Right away he started talking to Colonel Doolittle, and the colonel was very interested in him because, number one, he could speak the language, number two, he was looking for somebody to help round up the rest of the crews.
John told the airmen they were 50 or 60 miles behind enemy lines, and the area would be teeming with spies. But he could take them as far as the city of Lanchi, where Chinese officers could help them get to Chongqing. The riverboat began its slow journey up the river with the heroic American airmen, guided by missionary John Birch.
It gave us some idea that maybe we were on the right track and not getting shanghaied somewhere. Could have very easily happened by the way some of the other people's experiences, that they were picked up by English-speaking people and turned over to the Japanese.
Colonel Doolittle knew that John Birch was the right man to help locate and rescue surviving crewmen of the Tokyo Raiders, to provide necessary aid and guide them to safety. All of this, and Birch had not yet put on a uniform. Doolittle was greatly intrigued by this American missionary, his slim, strong physique, hair dyed black to look like a Chinese coolie, dressed in nondescript peasant clothing. Birch told him about his offer to the American military command to become a chaplain. Doolittle promised to recommend him to the military authorities in Chongqing. On July 4, 1942, the young missionary was sworn in as second lieutenant. General Claire Chennault, leader of the American Air Force in China, already had a chaplain, but he needed an officer who could obtain vital information from the Chinese. John Birch was that man.
Chennault said, "John, I've got a job I want you to, you know the territory and everything. I got a little job I want you to do for me." And John said, "Well, I'll be glad to." So he said, all over in spots of China, we have put supply dumps with gasoline and ammunition and stuff at secret little places. and I really need to know how many of these are still intact and in what shape they're in so we can depend on them later. And so John said, be glad. So John went out on this mission for Chenault and came back, gave him a full report, and Chenault was just amazed at all the information and how quickly he had gathered this information. So the wheels started turning in Chenault's head. He said, I've got me an intelligence department.
Lieutenant John Birch wasted no time in organizing a military intelligence unit to serve in what was to become the 14th Air Force.
One of the newer major air bases of the Chinese-American wing is located at Guilin, about 450 miles southeast of Chongqing. For maximum protection, installations are keyed back among the limestone buttes, making taxiways and hangars hard to strop. The personnel consists of Chinese flyers who receive their advanced training, as you can see by their occupation, in the United States. These men have already seen service against the Japs. They are supplemented by seasoned American pilots selected from the 14th Air Force.
Birch's fluency with the Chinese language, his knowledge of Chinese customs, his rapport with the people, made him indispensable to the covert operations. John Birch was a self-taught radio technician from his boyhood days. He was able to build and operate radio units which were to transmit vital information among his network of secret observers. On orders from General Chenault, Birch went deep behind enemy lines to a fishing village overlooking a bay. There he enlisted trustworthy fishermen to commence a daily coastal watch. He taught them how to work the crank-operated radio and devised a code system to confuse the Japanese. John set up more stations along the coast before returning to headquarters. By then, 50 to 60 ship sightings per day were being received. Operations then dispatched planes from various Chinese airfields to attack the Japanese ships.
This is the crew of a B-24 of the 308th Bomb Group, which started on a mission to Kowloon. Serious engine trouble developed, and 7 men were ordered to bail out.
How long did it take you to get in? 12 days. 12 days. Who else did you get in? The Chinese, the government, the Chinese soldiers, the guerrillas, and also the missionaries, both American and Chinese.
Ernest Johnson, a young B-25 tail gunner whose plane was forced down after losing an engine in combat, reflects on his association with John Birch.
We were walking towards town, and this, I think it was a 1939 Ford sedan drove up, and let's see, there were John Birch and a B-29 gunner had been shot down over Manchuria, and a P-40 pilot had been shot down over Hankow, and a Chinese colonel, and then a Chinese lieutenant who worked with John Birch. He had brought these people out from behind the lines, and he came up to us and said, "Hi, I'm John Birch," and introduced himself, and he was quite a charismatic person. You immediately liked him. You know, he had a smile on his face, and was pleasant and real friendly. And of course the B-29 gunner and the P-40 pilot thought he was great because he had rescued him, and he just loved doing that sort of thing. He liked to talk about the Chinese, their customs and idiosyncrasies and superstitions, and well, one story I remember he liked to tell was when he was a Baptist missionary, he was learning the language, the Chinese language, and wasn't very good at it. And in Chinese, just a different inflection on a word will change the meaning completely. And at one time he was preaching to a congregation of Chinese, and he thought he was saying, "Now we'll pass the sacrament." And they thought that he said, "Now we'll take out the knife," and we're going to have a human sacrifice. And so all the Chinese got up and ran out of the building.
A word about the situation the Lord has led me into. Free China is rightly named. What a glorious liberty to preach the gospel is mine. Within 100 miles of Shengjiao, there are hundreds of towns and villages without the gospel and hundreds of thousands of souls who have not once heard the message of salvation. This is the least evangelized place in all of China. What a privilege is mine. May I use it rightly. John Birch, Letter to the Fundamentalist Newspaper, February 6, 1942.
For his participation in the Coastal Sighting Campaign of 1943, John receives the Legion of Merit Medal from General Chennault and was soon promoted to captain. It was during this time that John Birch was to meet Dorothy Ewan, a young lady of Chinese-American descent, whose charm would eventually occupy a very special place in the heart of this American adventure.
I met John Birch, would be probably 1943, and this was in Kukong, China. It's a southern city in Guangdong province. And I had a storekeeper she sold all sorts of staples, and she invited me to her house, her store, and they closed it up for the evening, and they were having a big dinner. And she invited me, and I was wondering why she invited me. And when I got there was a number of Chinese people, and then there was this one American, and that was John Birch. So I think she invited me because I could speak English to him. Not that it mattered, because he spoke fluent Chinese, but she thought it was nice, and so that's how we met. We got into conversation and everything, and then he walked me home. It was later on that I met more American boys. They came into this little town, and they established a radio station there. We'd get the location of the enemy planes taking off, and we would get it in that office, and then we'd tell the boys upstairs, and they would transmit it to our airplanes. I eventually had a job there. That's why I know. See, I went to work there. But see, then I got to know those boys, and I didn't see John for a long time, until eventually he knew that I was there, and then he knew, he saw one of the officers, I think it was, and told him to say hello. It was later on that I've got a letter from my father saying that my mother was in this particular province, across the lines, and she was stranded there with her daughter, one of my aunts, and they were running out of money, and they said there was a secret airstrip, American airstrip, not far, and they wondered if they could get out. And I was on my way to the mess hall that's when John came up behind me. And during our meal, I told him what's happening, and he said, well, let's have our dinner, and afterwards we'll go into it and see what. So he told me then, he says not to worry, that he thinks he'll be able to rescue my grandmother. And of course later he was able to. Two of his men had flown in there and rescued my grandmother and brought her out. But he died before I was ever able to thank him. Never able to thank him.
Former Air Force Captain Mac McCullough was a member of the 14th Air Force Department of Distribution. His crew would distribute planes and aircraft parts and supplies to forward bases. It became his assignment to take John Birch behind enemy lines to carry out covert operations. Mac McCullough recalls some of those crucial operations.
He offered his services to the general to tell us when we knew in Kunming within 15 minutes where the Jap fighters or the bombers were going, when they would arrive, at what altitude, what they were carrying, and he would get that information from the Chinese, which were empowered by the Japanese, and that in turn was transferred out to John Birch in the foothills, maybe a mile or so away from the base. He would gather the information of these Japanese at the forward firing bases, and he would relegate that through radio coded message to Kunming and the Flying Tigers fighter group.
But John Birch seemed to know everybody out there. Literally, General Chennault could know when the hangars opened on the enemy fields for them to raid our field. It was done without all this electronics that you use now. People with telephones, people with signal flags would signal the Japanese are coming. And then as you could tell by when you got one here and one here, you knew the course they were flying. And General Chennault, that's the greatest thing he did, was form the air warning net, and John Birch, I'm certain, was the assistant on that.
It was his navigation that got us where we went, because I could never have found it otherwise. He was truly an intelligence officer for his home country of the United States. We had a standing order from the general that any time he walked into a forward base, that whatever we were doing had to stop. He was put on an airplane with a full load of fuel and transported by air from wherever he came into a forward base, transferred back to Kunming or wherever he wanted to go.
John Birch was sent to Kunming to form other units to stop the Japanese drive. He supervised the placement of 10 American air-ground units in North China. There, operating with the Chinese Army and units of the U.S. 14th Air Force, he was instrumental in containing the Japanese drive in Honan Province. With added fuel and ammunition, they wreaked havoc on the Japanese forces. During this time, the Joint Chiefs in Washington made a major change in command. General Vinegar Joe Stilwell was recalled to Washington, and Lieutenant General Albert C. Wiedemeyer took his place. Wiedemeyer pledged greater support for Chennault's 14th Air Force. While directing covert operations in Honan Province, Captain Birch suffered a recurrence of malaria and had contracted typhus. During his recovery, he met Lieutenant Bill Miller. He and Lieutenant Miller became close friends as they faced the fateful days ahead.
He was legendary when I came to China. The first thing I heard in China was this Captain Birch that everybody said was the greatest intelligence officer, and all that. And I had heard so much about him that I was really keen to go see John Birch. He was not in my organization. I had to go from a small air base way up in North China that was known as a forward base. And when I got to the base, it was just a fighter strip all it was up in the mountains. I arrived there on a C-47, and they told me that by lucky coincidence, Captain Birch had just come in the day before and was in a little hospital infirmary there with malaria, and he was burning up with fever. And yet he was still gracious and polite and apologized for his being out of sorts, and she said if I'd come back in a couple hours we could chat. So I came back a couple hours later, and the fever had passed, and then we were able to have a good talk. So then he told me all about his station, who to contact and who would meet me when they took me in the secret airfield, you see.
The war in Europe had ended. The Japanese were facing certain defeat in all of Asia. Captain John Birch continued his covert intelligence operations despite his dismay over the retirement of General Chennault. John's visits with Dorothy Yuen had been casual until the days of the spring of 1945. Their romance blossomed into serious love. But deep intuition convinced Dorothy that marriage might never be possible with this man who had pledged his life to his religious faith. The atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought swift surrender from the Japanese. Russian forces moved into Manchuria, and Chinese communist forces moved rapidly into Japanese territory in China, ahead of the nationalists and ahead of American forces. General Albert Wiedemeyer was determined to outflank the communists. He ordered OSS teams to Japanese bases to arrange surrender to the proper authorities. Captain John Birch and Lieutenant Bill Miller were ordered to the city of Suzhou, which had been a major Japanese headquarters. They took separate routes to get there. Birch's crew consisted of 3 Americans, 5 Chinese, and 2 Korean officers who spoke Japanese. Lieutenant Tang Fu Quan was aide to Captain Birch. Captain Birch believed the Chinese Communist forces would not interfere with an American mission traveling under orders from General Albert Wiedemeyer. He was tragically mistaken. The rail line on which the Birch party had been traveling was sabotaged by communist guerrillas. The American group then commandeered a rail handcar, breached the break in the rails, and proceeded towards Suzhou. Before reaching the city, they encountered a force of 300 communist troops. They attempted to confiscate the weapons and cargo of the American group. Birch demanded to speak to their commanding officer, but they never revealed the officer in charge. Instead, they were diverted to another communist squad farther along. Captain Birch ordered the members of his group to stay with their equipment and the handcar, while he and Lieutenant Tung went ahead to Huangkao. They were accompanied by 2 communist soldiers. After several frustrating delays, Birch angrily demanded that he meet a responsible officer. Finally, a Chinese Communist officer stepped forth and demanded that Captain Birch be disarmed.
And the Communist commander was a regimental commander. He was furious because Birch was lecturing him in Chinese and saying, "What the hell are you doing? You know, you're ruining the railroad and you're destroying the hope for future of China and all that." So he treated them like little boys, you might say, bad little boys, misbehaving.
At that point, Lieutenant Tung intervened, saying only he should be allowed to take Captain Birch's weapon. The Chinese Communist officer then pointed to Tung and said, "Shoot him first." One of the soldiers fired, striking Lieutenant Tung in the right leg. Then the Communist officer shouted, "Shoot the American." The soldier fired. The bullet tore into the left thigh of Captain Birch. Lieutenant Tung heard Birch say, "I'm hit in the leg, I can't walk." More shots rang out. The two wounded men were dragged to an open pit on the edge of town and left there to die. It was several days later that Lieutenant Bill Miller, who had been John Birch's companion officer on this fatal mission, arrived at Suzhou. There he discovered the horrifying news of his friend's death.
That's when I was confronted with the newspaper in Chinese. They translated for me the Captain American by the name of Bei, Captain Bei, they called him, had been killed by the communists, and that his body had been brought into the morgue there in Suzhou by the Japanese army just that day. And there he was. Oh, I have photographs of him, you know, no flesh on his face. The communists scalped him, cut his ears off, and his no flesh on his face.
Could this brutal killing have been avoided? Could John Birch have spared his own life by acting differently? Some believe that John's murder was an intentional effort to use the loss of his own life as a catalyst for a U.S. fight against Chinese communism. This idea is supported by Lieutenant Kwong Fu-tung, survivor of this tragedy. He reported that when he cautioned John about the possible consequences of showing resistance or antagonism toward these communist troops, John simply replied, "It matters not what happens to me, but it is important that our people back home know what kind of people we're dealing with here, whether they are friend or foe." What of the Chinese-American girl to whom John Birch had expressed his love? Dorothy Ewan had been totally involved in her duties with the 14th Air Force Service Group since she and John had parted earlier in the summer. After the Japanese surrender, Dorothy was awaiting an assignment in Kunming. Ready to board a C-47, an officer friend approached her and said, "Dottie, John's been killed." Dorothy was stunned by the news. Dazed and speechless, she climbed aboard her flight to Kunming. She carried out her duties by sheer force of habit, but she agonized to know the real truth of John's death. Upon her return to Chongqing, she searched constantly for more information, but without success. Then one day, while going through her volume of military mail, there was a letter for her. It was from Captain John Birch. It was dated August 13, 1945, written before John had been murdered by the communists.
Dear Dorothy, perhaps I can find a way to see you again soon. The radio for the past 3 days has been loud with rumors of Japan's imminent surrender. It really begins to look as if this terrible war will soon be over. Yesterday, Sunday morning, I held a church service here, thanking God for bringing us to the eve of victory. All the men in my station attended, excepting one operator who could not leave his transmitter. I believe I shall visit my family as soon as I can, then return to China to resume missionary work. Some people want me to stay in the Army as an intelligence officer, but I can't escape from the conviction that God has called me to the other. Please write me whenever you can. Affectionately, John.
Following the Japanese surrender and the official end of World War II, the family of Captain John Birch was anxiously awaiting his return home, but news from China was still heavily censored by American officials. It was not until September 27, 1945, that the Birch family received notification from the War Department. Mrs. Ethel Birch, John's mother, recalls that fateful message.
The war was over, and we were looking forward to John's return. Then one morning, a cab came out carrying a telegram from the War Department, and this is what it said: Birch, Captain John M., and they gave the serial number. Killed by stray bullets on the Lunghai Railway en route to Suzhou, China. This came as an especial shock because John had been, almost in a miraculous way, spared in very dangerous and hazardous experiences in connection with his work as an intelligence officer. A few days after this, about 10 days after this, a young man from the Veterans Department in Macon came, and it was in this very room he sat down and put his clipboard on the table and said, "I've come to see you regarding your son's death." And he said, "Now what word have you received?" I handed him the word we had gotten from Washington, and while he looked at the word we had gotten, I picked up his clipboard, and there I saw photostat, and this is what it said: Birch, Captain John M., and gave his serial number, killed by Chinese communists on the Lunghai Railway en route to Suzhou, China. And I immediately said, "Why, this is different from ours." He snatched it away from me and said, "You are not to see that." I said, "Why not? It's our son." And he said, "Well, it might not be right." And I said, "You mean to say a photostat is wrong and a typed copy is right?" Then he said, "Well, don't say anything about this. In a few months, in a few weeks, I'll be out of the service." He said, "They might court-martial me if they knew this information was in your hands." Now that was the beginning of our investigation.
Mrs. Birch told of the citations that were recommended for her son, but that were never received.
Colonel Wilfred Smith recommended John for the Silver Star, which was never awarded. Captain James A. Hart recommended John for the Congressional Medal of Honor. All we asked for was the one that we had gotten word that he was going to receive. That was the Distinguished Service Cross. All we wanted was this one thing.
Is it true that a hero, like a prophet, is not without honor except in his own country? The nationalist Chinese government bestowed upon Captain John Birch their highest military honor granted to a foreigner, the Order of the Cloud and Banner. What was the reaction of top U.S. military officials to the murder of Captain John Birch by Chinese communists? General Albert Wiedemeyer was outraged that one of his key officers would be brutally murdered, and that other soldiers of his command would be held captive by troops thought to be our allies. General Wiedemeyer demanded of U.S. Ambassador Patrick Hurley a meeting with the Chinese Communist leaders, Chairman Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. Wiedemeyer was brusque and to the point as he spoke to the Communist leaders. This is a portion of the top-secret transcript, since declassified, of that tense meeting in Ambassador Hurley's office. These were the words of General Wiedemeyer.
This afternoon, I received a radiogram that one of my captains, Captain Birch, was killed by Red Communist troops in the vicinity of Suzhou. This is a very serious and very grave incident.
General Zhou Enlai responded,
"Why was he there?"
He was sent there by me several weeks ago to obtain information about the Japanese.
Why?
I feel that I can and must send Americans anywhere in China to carry out my mission.
You mean any place?
Yes.
At this point, Chairman Mao Zedong retorted,
"We cannot say the communists killed him or not. If this is true that the communist troops shot this American officer, I extend my deepest apology.
I would like assurance that this will not occur again. I desire a full explanation of this incident, including an investigation and full written report, submitted to me not later than September 10th. I must report this incident to the War Department. It is very important indeed. The American people will unquestionably be very angry about this incident."
Very little was ever revealed to the American people about the death of Captain John Birch.
It was a known fact in China that he'd been killed by the communists, because I had reported that personally to General Wiedemeyer, and I had been commended in November by General Wiedemeyer for my investigation of the murder of Captain John Birch. Then I went back to the Pentagon, and I was assigned I was a regular Army officer, you see, and I was assigned to the Pentagon, a military intelligence service, in liaison with the State Department. And then I suddenly discovered that the Birch murder was secret, not to be discussed, and that was it.
We were winning the war in China, but the communists were moving in all the time. And that's the terrible thing about it. At the very wrong time, they took over. I imagine they suspected that he knew too much about them, like Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. I don't know that, but I just suspected it.
One of the major reasons that the communists knew that he must be destroyed, he was in their area working together with the communists to get a correlated fighting force. They knew him, he knew them, they knew he would be a threat to their desire to occupy and take over China, so they removed the threat and they took over China. They killed him. As the Apostle Paul wrote, I'm in the straits, I far rather depart and be with the Lord, but it's expedient that I stay here and edify the church. John also desired to stay and continue to serve the Lord, but if it was his time to depart, he was ready to go.
John Birch was a man of God, spreading his word on China's soil. When the rising sun cast shadows o'er the land, General Chennault asked him to lend a hand. Every man must take a stand. John Birch, John Birch, John Birch, John Birch, you did your duty much too well, much too well. Many the brave deeds you have done, many the victory you have won. Where brave deeds were common, the bravest of them all was John Birch, the patriot, answering the call. John Birch, the soldier standing tall. John Birch, John Birch, John Birch, John Birch, you did your duty much too well, much too well. Communism reared its head, patriotism painted red, tainted with the blood of freedom-loving men before. And that's why you had to die, silenced evermore, killed in a new and different war. John Birch, John Birch, John Birch, John Birch, you did your duty much too well, much too well. They could not not erase your name. History will